Hi there, I'm Mark, and in this video we are going to take another look at the new responsive engine in Bubble. As you probably know, the responsive engine is built upon the flexbox concept of CSS. And today we are going to check whether everything that can be built with CSS and HTML can also be built in Bubble, or whether there are any differences. So we are going to start out with some very basic HTML. We are going to add some CSS to the mix. And afterwards, after we've built a basic layout, we are trying to rebuild exactly the same thing in Bubble. So this is going to be interesting, especially if you have some prior knowledge in HTML and CSS. If you have played around with the flexbox concept in CSS already, then this is the video for you. And even if you don't have any prior experience with HTML and CSS, it might be worth watching this video because I'm explaining some very basic concepts of flexbox in Bubble. So let's start. All right, so as today we are going to write some HTML code, we are going to start out with CodePen. I chose CodePen because it's an easy to use tool. It makes it easy for me to share the sources with you, although they shouldn't be too complex. And also you can get started for free as long as you're not using CodePen Pro. So let's create a new pen here and name it. And as I said, it's not going to be too complex. Basically, we are just creating a very basic HTML structure made of div elements. There's going to be an outer div and there's going to be a few inner divs, meaning they are nested inside of the outer div. And in order to be able to distinguish those divs from each other, we are going to add, well, class names to the divs. So there's one outer container and a few inner containers, but also we are going to assign some IDs to the inner containers. And also we are going to add some text to them. All right, so we are just going to duplicate this inner element until we have 4 of those. All right, and as you can see here, this is the output. It looks just like that, just 4 rows, but in fact there's 5 HTML elements and we got 4 on the inside, and there's this outer container which of course you cannot see at the moment, but we are going to change that by adding some CSS code there. So first we are going to choose another font here. We're going to go with Consolas, and also we are going to add some background color to the canvas over there. Something like this. All right. And also, in order to be able to actually tell the divs apart, we are going to add some border around the divs. So we are going to target every div element on the page, and we are adding a border which is 1 pixel thick and solid. All right, looks just like that. We're going to give it the black color. And now I'm targeting the outer container specifically, right? Because I have assigned the class outer container to this div. I can target it with .outer container. And here I'm going to add some padding, because right now the different divs, they are very close together, right? The borders look pretty thick because they are located directly next to each other, and now we are going to add some spacing here, right? So first I'm going to add some padding to the outer container, which means that inside of the outer container will be 20 pixels of space added. Just like that. All right, now you can easily see the outer container, right? Then there's 20 pixels of space on every side. And then there's the inner container, which are, well, inner containers which are stacked on top of each other. Now we are going to control how the outer div behaves if we resize the visible part of the screen, the viewport, so to say. So first let's add a minimum width for the outer element, which means by telling the browser min width equals 320 pixels, the outer container won't shrink any more than 320 pixels. We can see that if we resize the viewport, so it keeps on growing with the viewport, but if we go smaller, we can see that it stops right there. And this is at 320 pixels in width. And also we can set the maximum width of this outer container, which means it stops growing at a certain point, right? So as soon as this outer container has reached 1200 pixels in width, it stops growing. And also, of course, the 320 pixels minimum width still apply. Okay, so we can set a fixed height for the outer container, which looks like this. So the inner elements, they don't grow, apparently, right? They are just in this one line because of the box model. And also, we can now center this outer container on the page. We could do this with flexbox, but up to now, we haven't used flexbox at all. We've just named the inner containers accordingly, but in fact, there is no flexbox involved here. We can center this outer container by setting margin left to auto as well as margin right to auto, right? So the outer container is centered and, well, already behaves pretty responsively, right? Again, we haven't played around with flexbox here at all. We've just set up this outer container with a few nested inner containers, and we have centered this outer container on the screen and have given it a maximum width and a minimum width, which already looks pretty much like a page layout. Now we are going to modify the inner containers a little bit. So we are giving them a minimum width here of 150 pixels and also a fixed height of 150 pixels. So they grow bigger here. Minimum width didn't have an immediate effect because, of course, it's a minimum width, right? It doesn't determine the width itself. It's not a fixed width, it's just a minimum width. So this setting would come into effect if we were to resize the screen again. All right, so also a different background color so that we can tell them apart, just like that. And now we are going to add display flex, which makes the whole thing, or at least the inner containers, every inner container behave like a flexbox. And if you remember from the other videos, if you tell an element, a container, to be a flexbox, then every element inside of that container is either placed in a row or in a column. And we can determine whether it's a row or a column by setting the flex direction. So here we are going to tell the element, hey, everything, every direct child should be placed in a row. So it should be placed along the horizontal axis. You can also put it in another way. By setting the flex direction to row, you're telling the element that the main axis is a horizontal one, right? It's horizontal. And the cross axis is a vertical one. If you would say the flex direction is a column, then the main axis would be the vertical one, and the cross axis would be the horizontal one. This might sound a little bit confusing. If you wanna, well, dive a little bit into the theoretic aspects of the whole flexbox concept, you can watch the first video that I'm linking here. But for now, let's stick with that. We have told the inner container, every inner container, that it's a flexbox now, and that every child inside of that inner container should be aligned along the horizontal axis. It should be aligned in a row. So there's actually not much effect here because, well, there's just one element inside of each container, and it's basically already aligned along the horizontal axis. So what we can do here is we can add the property justify content, and we can set this one to center. And what will happen now is that the elements will be placed in the center of the main axis. And the main axis is the horizontal axis because we have set flex direction to row. Here you can see the effect, right? So justify content determines how the elements are placed along the main axis. And what the main axis is determined by flex direction. All right. So align items refers to the cross axis. And here the cross axis is the vertical axis because again, you have set flex direction to row. If you were to set flex direction to column, everything would be switched. But still the effect in that case would be the same. The element inside of that container would be placed right in the middle of this inner container. All right, so align items refers to the cross axis, justify content refers to the main axis. Just like that. We can assign different values to this justify content property. So for example, if we want to have this flexbox element or this flexbox text in the center of the vertical axis, so right here, but at the start of the horizontal axis, we can say justify content flex minus start. And here you can see the effect, right? So it starts at the beginning of the main axis, but still in the center of the cross axis. So of course, different values are possible. Flex end, for example, then the element will appear here at the end of the main axis. So let's put it back into the center. And of course, there are different values possible for align items. Align items, again, refers to the cross axis, so this axis here. And if you tell the browser to place it at, well, flex start, then it's at the beginning of the cross axis, right here, or flex end at the end of the cross axis. So let's put it back into the center. So this is basically how flexbox works, right? So at first you tell the element by setting display flex that it should behave like a flexbox. And then by setting flex direction, you tell the element where the main axis runs. So it's either a row, as you've just seen, or a column. Okay, let's minimize all of this and play around a little bit more with outer container, because up to now, the inner containers have been flexboxes, but the outer container hasn't been a flexbox at all. But of course, we can also make the outer container behave like a flexbox. And again, we do that by setting display flex for the outer container. Okay, this has an effect. The inner elements are aligned in a row here, not in a column anymore. And this has to do with the fact that by default, if you set display flex, you have the horizontal axis as a main axis. So basically, by default, all the items, they are aligned in a row next to each other. And we can play around with that a little bit. So we can set flex direction to row. Again, this has no effect because this is the default already, but column will have an effect. Column will make the main axis run vertically, so this way, right? And all the items inside of the outer container, which are the inner containers, will be placed along this vertical axis. Just like that. So let's put it back in a row. And also we can add some column gap here. So in order to add some space between these elements, we will add the property column gap and set this to 20 pixels. So it looks like that. And if we now resize the viewport, you might assume there's going to be a line break right now, but as you can see, there is none. So the elements stay fixed and overlap with the outer container. This is actually not the intended behavior. So we need to add another property, which is flex wrap. And if you now resize the screen, the elements are going to wrap, there's a line break. Right now there's also a pretty huge space between these elements, but we are going to take care of that in a minute. So for now, let's again modify the inner container and tell them that they are allowed to grow, because right now they, well, they do not grow. They do not take up the space that's available to them here in a row. And we can change that by adding this flex grow property to the inner container, just like that. So they keep on growing as soon as they have, well, maxed out the space that's available to them, right? They won't grow any further than this because we have limited the width of the surrounding container of the outer container to 1200 pixels. But of course they are going to shrink until they can't shrink anymore, because the minimum width of the inner containers has been limited to 150 pixels. And if there's not enough space, there's this line break. And of course, this flexbox number 4, it takes up all the available space in the next line, and it shares the available space with flexbox 3 if we go smaller. And then there's this, well, this column here. Although we have set the flex direction to row, there's this column of these inner containers because we do not have enough space to fit 2 or more inner containers next to each other. All right. So far, so good. This looks pretty responsive already, but as I said, we've got this huge space between the inner containers as soon as there's a line break. So we are gonna add a row gap of 20 pixels, but well, this doesn't change anything for some reason. So maybe we should delete the fixed heights, and here we go. This looks like a nice responsive layout. We can go as small as 320 pixels and everything looks fine. Now we are going to try to replicate this behavior in Bubble. Because again, the idea of this video is to show you how you would do things with pure HTML and CSS, and whether you can do everything that's possible with HTML and CSS in Bubble too. So let's fire up Bubble. Let's create a new page. Something like flexbox comparison, and work with it. So first thing, we're going to set the exact background color, since we are trying to replicate the exact behavior that you've just seen in the code pen. So now we are going to add a new group, which corresponds to the outer container we had in our code pen. Normally, instead of divs, or what you usually do with divs in pure HTML, would be the group elements in Bubble. And because of that, we are going to add a new group element. We are going to rename it accordingly. I like to prefix my elements with 3 characters. So grp for group, underscore, and then the element's name. I'm going to delete the default style, and I'm going to add a solid color, 1 pixel wide, and it's going to be black, just like we did before. So we can place it freely on the canvas. This has to do with the fact that we haven't changed the container layout of the surrounding page element, but we can change the container layout of the group itself. And also, as mentioned, we should change the container layout of the parent element, which is the page. So we could select the page in the elements tree, or we can simply select the parent container of the outer container, which is the page element. So we can click here on edit. And now this here is the page element that we have selected. And here we can change the container layout from fixed to column. All right, we'll stick with those settings here. What we are focusing on are the settings of the outer container. And here we have removed the fixed width property of the outer container, and we will set the minimum width and the maximum width exactly to the same values as before. So 320 pixels of minimum width and 1200 pixels max width, and a height of 800 pixels. So playing around with a responsive view here, you can see that this outer container, this group, stops growing when we hit 1200 pixels. And well, it behaves pretty much responsively because we have a minimum width and a maximum width, and this allows this container to shrink or grow as much as needed. Okay, so if you remember, we have tried to place this container, this outer container, in the middle of the page. And we did that by adding some HTML and setting margin left and margin right to auto. Setting the margins to the value auto is not possible in Bubble, right? You can set the margins to a certain pixel value. This is just fine, but we cannot set it to auto. So we need to add some custom HTML. We are going to rename it and make it pretty much invisible by setting the width and height to 0. And just to make sure, I want to mention that this is not the way how you would usually center elements in Bubble. I'm just doing this in order to demonstrate, well, what we've done before in CodePen might not always work in Bubble. So we have added this HTML element. And now we can add our HTML code, but we need a way to address this outer container, right? We want to set the margin left and the margin right of this outer container to the auto value, but we need some class or ID to address this outer container. And this is, well, apparently not possible out of the box, right? There is no ID or class setting, and we can change that by going to settings. And in the general tab, there's this expose the option to add an ID attribute, and we are going to check here. And now there is this ID attribute field that we can fill. And for that, I'm just reusing the name that I've given to this outer container, right? So this is going to be the ID of this outer container, which makes it possible to address this outer container in the HTML element. So I'm going to add some HTML code here and add some CSS inside of it. So with this hashtag here, I'm addressing the ID grp_outer minus container, which is the ID of my outer container of this group. And I'm adding some margin left and margin right here, setting it all to auto. And I'm hoping that this will make sure that this outer container is placed right in the center of the page, just like it did when I was working with HTML in CodePen. Clicking on preview, and of course it doesn't work. This has to do with the fact that this margin left auto, margin right auto thing only works in certain circumstances. I won't go into detail right here, but there are great resources online. For example, on Stack Overflow, you will find a great discussion concerning this. So back to Bubble, we are going to basically undo everything. So we want to get rid of this HTML element. Of course, this is not going to be the way in which we do it. Instead, we are going to use the properties of flexbox in order to make this outer container centered on the page. So we've selected this grp outer container group, and here we got this container alignment setting that you can see here. Here we have this container alignment setting, and we can set it to centered, but this doesn't change anything, right? This group here is still stuck to the left-hand side of the canvas. And this is because this setting that we've just set here refers to the elements inside of that outer container. So here you're saying the container layout of this outer container should be a row layout, and everything inside of that outer container should be placed next to each other in a row. And here you tell it that it's going to be placed in the middle of this horizontal axis. So again, as we have no elements inside of that outer container, this has no effect. So we need to find a different setting. And this different setting is right there. So here you can see the parent container is a column. The parent container is the page element. And here we can change the horizontal alignment of the outer container in relation to the parent container. And here we can set it to centered. And this has exactly the effect that we were going for, right? So the page is the outer container is centered on the page. And now we can add a few inner containers, which again are basically just groups, right? So for each of these inner containers, we will set the container layout to row, which makes the inner container itself a flexbox. We set the minimum width to 150 pixels because that's what we've done before. And we are going to give it a fixed height of 150 pixels, just like before. All right, we need to add some text here. We're going to call it flex item 1. We're going for, well, pretty much the same font, not exactly, but still same color. And something I always do with text items, I'm removing the fixed width setting here, setting the minimum width to 0 and making the width fit to the content, and also removing the minimum height so it looks nice and tidy. And now we can play around a little bit with this inner container and its settings. We're going to remove the style here because we also need to have a border around this inner container. And here in the outer container, we need to add 20 pixels of padding on each side. And now we are pretty close to what we have done before. But we need to copy this inner container a few times. All right, so here you can see now I'm in the outer container and I've selected the container layout to be a column, and this leads to the inner containers being stacked on top of each other. Right, so let's rename this inner container, copy it a few times, and now set those up, right? So we're going to rename them. We're going to change the text inside of these outer containers, inner containers. And now it's almost the same setup like before. So just make sure that we have renamed everything here. Again, I'm using here the prefix approach. So 3 characters as a prefix in order to be able to tell those elements apart. And now we can play around a little bit with those inner containers. All right, so first I'm going to check the layouts tab of this inner container, and I'm going to change the container alignment to centered. So before I do that, let's think about what is going to happen if I do that. The container layout of this inner container here is set to row, which means that the elements inside that container are placed next to each other along the horizontal axis. Of course, you won't see that at the moment because there's just one item there. But if we click on centered, you will see that this item goes to the center of the horizontal axis. Just like that. All right. You will remember that we have placed this item or this text item in the center of the inner container before. So we need to find a way to do that in Bubble. Right now we could do it like that. So if we change the container layout to column, the elements are stacked on top of each other. So the main axis goes this way. Before it went that way. Now the main axis goes this way. And if we center the elements inside of the inner container along the main axis, when it's a column layout, it's going to be placed here. But again, we want it to appear here. So we need to find a way to center it along the main axis as well as along the cross axis. And for some reason, this doesn't seem to work here. So there's another alignment here, horizontal alignment. This, well, I mean, at least it looks like this might be the solution for that. But if I click on this, nothing happens. And this is because horizontal alignment here refers to the inner container itself in relation to its parent container, right? So this section here doesn't change the alignment of the items inside of the inner container. It changes the alignment of inner container in relation to its parent, to the outer container. And since the inner container stretches along, well, the available space, you don't see any effect here, but you will see in a second. So let's give this inner container a maximum width here of 500 pixels, right? So now you can see that it sticks to the left-hand side, and now we can change the horizontal alignment, and there you see the effect, right? Here the inner container is placed in the middle in relation to its parent container, which is outer container. All right, outer container has a flexbox layout. The container layout of the outer container is column, and here we can set the alignment of this inner container in relation to its parent. Well, again, because the parent is also flexbox. But, well, this is not exactly what we want, so let's undo all of this. Let's make it a row again. And we still got the issue that we have no option of placing this item along the cross axis. Again, we can place it along the main axis. So if it's a row, we can place it in the middle of the main axis of the horizontal one. But at least in this dialog here, we cannot place the item along the cross axis. So this is the big difference to the HTML part with it before. In order to place it along the cross axis, we need to select the item itself. And here we can set the vertical alignment. We can set the placement along the cross axis. And we are going to do that for the item itself. We are not going to do that in the container. And in my opinion, if you have worked with HTML and Flexbox before, this might seem a little bit weird. This needs some time to get used to, but in fact, you can reach the same effect as you did before with HTML. So all of this looks pretty much like our setup in HTML. So we go back to a row layout for the outer container, and as you can see, the elements, they stretch automatically. Right? Before we needed to make them stretch, we needed to make them grow in order to take up the available space there is in this row. But here in Bubble, it works out of the box. So we're going to set the column gap of 20 pixels. And by resizing it, you can see that also the wrapping occurs automatically. Before we had to set the flex wrap property, and here we don't need to. It works out of the box. And also there's this huge space between the elements, so we need to get rid of the minimum height. And this looks just fine, except that we need some row gap here. And well, now I would say it works perfectly, right? Just like in CodePen. Of course, we do not have the background color here, so let's add this one in order to be exactly the same. And well, after we've done that, that was the color of the border. So let's add some flat color here. Let's copy the formatting and paste it to the other inner containers. Just like that. That's how it behaves in Bubble. So let's get back to CodePen. And yeah, that's it pretty much for this tutorial. And as you were able to see, what we did with HTML and CSS was feasible in Bubble. Sometimes it was a little bit counterintuitive because how things were done in HTML and CSS is a little bit different to Bubble, but in the end, everything was available to us in Bubble, and we were able to replicate the very same layout that we did in CodePen with pure HTML and CSS in Bubble. So that's it for this video. Just to quickly wrap it up, we've built a basic responsive layout with pure HTML and CSS. We've used the flexbox concept, and then we have rebuilt everything in Bubble one-to-one. So although we needed to do some things differently, everything was feasible in Bubble. Up to now, because in the next video I'm going to show you a thing or two that won't work exactly like this in Bubble, so it might be worth watching. If you don't want to miss a video, then please subscribe to my channel. If you like this one, give me a like, and have a nice day. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.